360 million people. That's how many deaths the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists estimates there would be promptly in a nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia. To put that in perspective, that's approximately 30 million more people than the total population of the United States of America. So, normally you go to a talk like this, right, and the speaker wants to make a point about the proportionality of the threat that they're talking about, and they have every other person in the audience put their hand up, or 1 in every 4 people put their hands up, and look around, look at the person next to you, and see who would theoretically not be there. With those kinds of numbers, I guess we should all just go ahead and put our hands up, huh? Especially in our line of work. Now, if you're a contrarian and you say, I don't know that I really buy those numbers. Those numbers are based off outdated information. Okay. Well, a more recent study by Princeton's estimated that it would be 91 million minimum casualties and deaths. Now, it's casualties and deaths, but still, 91 million people, right? Normally, when I talk about this topic, I like to start this way. And I ask folks if they can take a guess at when this was the cover of Time magazine. Does anybody have any idea? It's March 29th of 1982, right before the Able Archer incident in 1983, which many argued was the closest we had come to nuclear war during the Cold War after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, do people get magazines anymore? Is that still a thing? I don't know, but if you were walking past a newsstand in downtown Manhattan today and you saw that on the rack, could it be relevant? Would it be possible? I think so. But I have to admit, when I came to study here in 2019, I was a little bit like these two. I was clueless. And those who are in my cohort know I'm notorious for my South Park and Beavis and Butthead references in my talks. This one will be no different. And as the lecture goes on, I'll let you make conjectures about which of the two that I more closely identify with. But I was clueless, and as we just heard, I was also somebody who didn't think that this would be a topic that I would ever be talking about publicly, or that my research here would ever be relevant. So I wrote my thesis on search and rescue after a nuclear attack. I didn't think we'd ever really be having this conversation. If anything, I thought that maybe by studying a high-level problem such as this, we could glean some lessons for other big events, other big disasters, or, I don't know, doing rescue work in contaminated environments. But then something happened. Just over a year ago, Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation shocked the world when they engaged in a conventional conflict and invaded Ukraine. And all of a sudden, my phone started blowing up. What was that stuff that you wrote again about rescuing people after a nuclear attack? That's because the conversation went somewhere, or the situation went somewhere that I don't think we're all surprised it's ended up. And we have a little problem now, don't we? As you just heard this morning, Vladimir Putin in his address to the Russian people stated that he's pulling back from the New START treaty, the last agreement between the United States and Russia on nuclear weapons, right? That was the agreement that limited the strategic deployment of weapons to roughly 1,500 on either side, and he's decided he's going to step away from that. So we have a little problem. But what bothers me, especially as I've traveled and spoke on this topic a little bit now, particularly my research, and how this relates to the Homeland Security enterprise, is that everywhere I go, this problem still seems to be the elephant in the room. It's almost like it's just easier not to talk about it, or we would just rather put on blinders and pretend it's not there. I think some of that has to do with the enormity of the problem and how intimidating it is. But that's why I'm here today. I want to engage you. I want to talk about it. Let's talk about it. We got something we need to talk about. So let's talk. So those who know me or have heard my talks before know that I love history. And I don't think that we can have an honest conversation about the threat that is facing us unless we have a conversation as well about where we've been. Right? You can't define where you're going if you don't acknowledge where you've been. And so for us, this story begins in July of 1945 with the Trinity test. The United States detonated the first atomic weapon in the desert of New Mexico and kicked off the nuclear age. And for a while, it was okay because we were the only ones with the bomb, right? But again, when we developed the bomb, we weren't the only ones trying to get it, right? It was a race. And then in 1949, in what NATO, or what the United States came to designate as the Joe 1 test, in reference to Joseph Stalin, the Russians detonated a bomb, kicking off the arms race. Now, most historians will say, okay, the Cold War really began in 1948, but this was the defining moment. This was the turning point. This was the pivot. And all of a sudden, we had to be worried about an adversary dropping one of those bombs on us. Some of you probably recognize this picture from your high school history class. This is one of the Apple houses, the Apple II test, which was conducted to see how different building materials and different structures would hold up under a nuclear attack. But I think the point here is that this threat and what we had to do to face it is kind of what kicked off the emergency profession, the emergency management profession as we know it today. And that was really the case for decades. This was the first time we really collectively brought all those principles together and acknowledged that we had this common threat that we had to address in the home front. Now, city busting is its own interesting, unique military science topic that's better relegated to another conversation. But this threat was real, and it was a common threat to all of us. And that lasted up until the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed. Now, there were other threats that emerged after that, right? My program, Cooperative Threat Reduction at DITRA, was stood up. That was to address the issue of loose nukes. You'll hear that thrown around sometimes. And there were conflicts in the 90s, right? We had Operation Gothic Serpent, or Battle of the Black Sea, Black Hawk Down, as it's more colloquially known. I knew I was going to butcher that. Our first fight with Iraq, right? But relatively speaking, the 90s were pretty peaceful. With even academics like this gentleman, and now because this is recorded and probably going to be blasted on the internet, I feel an obligation to Mr. Fukuyama to say, sir, you're far smarter than I will ever be, so I'm not throwing shade. But he wrote a book, The End of History and the Last Man, that pretty much made the argument that, well, liberal democracy prevailed and we don't have anything to worry about. This is it. And we're all just going to live in paradise off into the sunset, right? And then this happened. Another shocking event that really defined the security profession and our approach to security for the following 20 years, right? I mean, this is the reason that we're all sitting here right now. It's why CHDS exists, why the Department of Homeland Security, in theory, exists. Internally, here at home, as far as security goes, we became really terrorism-centric, right? Our security policy became concerned with keeping bad stuff out, keeping terrorists out, and finding the terrorists within. That bled over into our defense policy and our foreign policy as well, right? Around the globe, we engaged in the global war on terror, which eventually became a series of counterinsurgency operations. And again, this is kind of how our security posture looked for 20 years. And we thought that was the primary threat, at least at that time, that we were worried about. But there was a gentleman who wrote a book, Dr. David Kilcullen. Now, he was a member of the Australian military who ended up advising several folks within the American government on counterinsurgency operations during the global war on terror. But he wrote this book called The Dragons and the Snakes: How the Rest Learned to Fight the West. And the title comes from the testimony of former CIA Director Woolley, who made a comment in his testimony to the Senate shortly after the Soviet Union fell, that the United States had defeated a big dragon, but now it was facing a world full of a bewildering variety of poisonous snakes, is the way I think that he put it. He was talking about terrorists, non-state actors. But the argument in his book is that these power competitors, these state actors that we'd kind of been ignoring or didn't think were such a big deal anymore, they were watching. They were watching how the snakes were engaging the United States. And some might argue, winning, or at least doing a good job of giving us a hard time. And that's where you kind of see the rise of asymmetric warfare, which was a popular term when I was studying here. And then our politics internally took a very, very divisive turn. Right? We can't agree on anything anymore. The lecture that you heard before this one couldn't have been any better of an introduction for this presentation. Because as I said, the dragons have been watching and they've been waiting for their opportunity. And now this is what we're facing. So obviously I've identified 4 state actors up here that I think need to be our primary concern. I would encourage you not to be reductionist in lumping them all together haphazardly when you're thinking about them. Make no mistake, each of them has their own interests, their own desires, their own relationship with one another. But it's becoming increasingly clear to me, anyways, that they're not shy about aligning themselves in unison and challenging the West, liberal democracy, and the United States. And even more concerning, they're not shy about how they feel towards nuclear weapons, are they? Obviously, this morning, we heard about Russia announcing that they're going to step away, or at least take a step back from New START. China hasn't been quiet about how they intend to bolster and build their nuclear deterrent. Iran is enriching uranium every day and getting closer and closer to having a bomb, if they don't already. And we just don't know about it. And North Korea. Would any of us really be surprised if we flipped on CNN tonight and saw that North Korea had conducted another nuclear test? Or at least fired some more ballistic missiles into the ocean? I wouldn't be surprised. And so the question that I normally get is, okay, great. What do we do about it? Particularly in the context of the Homeland Security enterprise. I'll get calls all the time by folks, emergency managers, responders, people who are just curious who work in our industry. And they always want to know, my opinion, what should we do about this? Can we do anything about it? If there was a nuclear attack in the United States, could we respond? What do we need to be doing to prepare? Well, it seems to me that there is one option of approaching this, and it goes back to my reference of the elephant in the room, that we could just throw up our hands and say, well, you know what? You said 360 million people. How can we do anything about that? What can we possibly do? Should we just throw up our hands and say, you know what? That happens. We're not going to be successful anyway. There's nothing we can do. So I'm not going to waste my time on it. When I conducted my research, I spoke with several special operations coordinators in fire departments around the country, and I said, nuke debt happens in your town. What do you want from the DoD in terms of search and rescue? And the response that I got overwhelmingly was, nuke debt. Dude, I can't get firefighters to tie figure 8 knots properly. Why are you asking me about nuke debts? Okay, now here's a rope guy. Why are you asking me about nuke debts, man? I got 1,000 other problems. I can't be worried about this. But the question I would pose to you, am are we as a security profession, are we as the Homeland Security enterprise prepared to look the public in the eye? The same people who look to us after 9/11 for solutions and engage in nihilism and throw our hands up and say, we got nothing, man. Is that really what we want to do? I think there's an alternative. I see an opportunity here, believe it or not. And the answer is aliens. And I'm not talking about Chinese spy balloons either, all right? I know there's been a lot of chatter about aliens and shooting down balloons lately. But all this talk reminded me of a story. In 1985, President Reagan met with Gorbachev in Geneva. The topic of conversation was arms control, and it wasn't going well. Right, I mentioned the Able Archer exercise earlier, right? Some folks thought that was the closest we came to nuclear war or a nuclear engagement with Russia after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Conversation wasn't going well. So Reagan took Gorbachev off for a walk. Just them and their interpreters. And he looked Gorbachev in the eye and said something to the effect of, hey, if aliens threatened the United States tomorrow, if we were facing an alien invasion, would you help us? And Gorbachev laughed and said, well, of course. And that softened the conversation. They had found a common problem, albeit a fictional one. But by identifying a common problem, by acknowledging that, hey, we're kind of in this together, man, they found a way to break down walls and have some honest conversation and get somewhere. Abraham Lincoln said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. We're divided right now in a lot of ways, aren't we? But I think what concerns me the most is that we can't deny that what happens in the homeland reverberates overseas. When I was a young firefighter, I had an old bomb squad cop who was my professor when I was pursuing my undergrad tell me, hey, watch the news overseas. Watch the threat trends overseas. And then you'll know what to expect in the homeland in the future. I kind of think we're getting to a point where the opposite is kind of true. Where if you watch our domestic politics, you can kind of predict when bad things are going to happen throughout the rest of the world. And so that's exactly why I think it is our responsibility as security professionals and as the Homeland Security enterprise to do something, to lead this charge, to not wait. And when I was growing up, I was blessed to be surrounded by folks who were public servants, people who you could always trust to do the right thing, people who took responsibility for their communities. My friends' parents were cops, firefighters, soldiers. My own father, he used to donate his time to take care of the homeless in downtown Louisville. They didn't wait. When there was a problem in the community, they stepped up. And you could always trust them to do the right thing. And as I look around the room, I see some faces of folks that I would put in that category, who influenced me when I was growing up and taught me that lesson. So I think it's time to do this again. Don't wait. It's up to us to drive the narrative. It's up to us to drive the conversation. And that's exactly what we're doing here right now. I think it's worth saying, along with that the messaging hasn't been very clear, at least from the federal government, what the role of state and local officials and responders should be in an era of renewed power competition, or strategic competition, whatever we're calling it today. It was clear after 9/11, would you agree? Looked a lot like this. So I posed that question to a very high-level DoD official at a conference 2 years ago. I said just that. I said, hey, the messaging hasn't been good. What is our role as the Homeland Security enterprise to support you in an era of renewed power competition? And he didn't hesitate. He said, reverse DSCA. What's DSCA? Defense support to civil authorities. It was my enterprise whenever I was working for the Department of the Army. It's what I studied when I wrote my thesis about how the DoD could support you when really bad things happen. And he put it back on me. It's up to you to think about what you bring to the table. It's up to you to think about what you can do to help the DoD, what you can do to help the federal government and contribute to the fight. And so again, I think it's on us to not wait for direction, but to take the reins. And fortunately for us, history provides us with a model of how we can do this. That was the point of the history lesson. We know what this looks like. We've done this before. We can do it again. Something that I found shocking in my research, it's not shocking now that I look back upon it, but in the DoD Seaburn Response Enterprise, again, that's the force that's going to show up if a nuke debt happens in your town or another really bad event. There are roughly 18,000 soldiers, airmen, sailors, and Marines. And everything in my research indicates that if this happens, if a nuclear attack happens of any size, boy, are we going to need all 18,000 of them. We need everybody. This is truly a whole of society threat. And so again, that's why I say it's on us to drive the conversation, to think about how we address one another, how we speak with one another, how we debate with one another, how we hold one another, and the messages that we push out that promote a sense of unity, common identity, and a common problem. Because we've done it before and it worked. So we've talked about this at a very high level. Those are very strategic things. I wanted to leave you with, or propose to you, one action level thing that I think we can do right here at the center that kind of puts all this into action. This is the Center for Homeland Defense and Security. We need to put the Homeland Defense back into Homeland Defense and Security. I mentioned Sebastian Junger earlier and his book, Tribe. At the end of the book, he talks about the importance of talking about the things and discussing the things not that just divide us, but that unite us. And focus on that a little bit. When I was going through the program here, we spent an awful lot of time talking about all the divisive things that could easily divide us. And there's a lot of them in Homeland Security, right? We work in a tough field, an increasingly politically volatile field. Immigration is one of those things that instantly comes to mind. But it's just as important that we talk about those common problems that unite us, that we remind the folks in the cohorts that there are common problems that we have to put our heads together and solve. Sebastian Junger said, to some degree, we have to think of the United States as one big combat outpost. Because anyone who isn't is deluding themselves. I think we're seeing that. Because at the end of the day, according to the doomsday clock, it's 90 seconds to midnight. And whether you like it or not, we're all in this together. That's all I have.